Why is Blood Meridian such a great novel? Well, today we are going to hear from the legendary literary critic Harold Bloom, who is going to do a deep dive analysis on some of the more subtle aspects of Blood Meridian. And if you guys don't already know, my name is Ian, and on this channel, we cover everything related to Cormac McCarthy. I already have over 150 videos in the playlist down below if you are interested in diving deeper into Cormac McCarthy's works. So let us now hear from Bloom. Quote, what it does whenever the tension even begins to fall off is to very skillfully take you away from the center, which is the relentless drive of Glanton and the judge. The kid cannot be called the center. His consciousness is too intimate. He fades out too often, quite deliberately. But McCarthy finds ways, much subtler than they seem at first, of giving you side stories, like Brown going to have his gun fixed, or the extraordinary interlude of the breakup of the Yuma ferry and everything connected with it. There is a surge of narrative propulsiveness and power in the book, and an astonishing charge of language, which finally, in spite of its clear Faulknerian and Melvillean affinities and sources, goes back beyond Faulkner and Melville to their source, particularly Melville's in Shakespeare, which is why I think Iago shows up so powerfully in The Judge. And I found in writing a book about Shakespeare and writing about Othello that I couldn't really talk about Iago without bringing up The Judge. Not that The Judge is a Machiavel, far from it, but that the judge is a pyromaniac who wants to set the whole world on fire with warfare and blood. And so Bloom has a great analysis here because on the show I talk about how Blood Meridian doesn't really have a plot. Oh, the plot. There's a group of scalp hunters and they're trying to find their way down in Mexico, but it's not that strong. And if the story was just that, it wouldn't be that interesting. But this is something that McCarthy has done for most of his career. All throughout the Border trilogy, we have all these side quests and these random characters and troops who tell all these kind of metaphorical or symbolic stories. And the same thing happens in Blood Meridian. For instance, Bloom mentions Brown going to have his gun fixed. Well, that seems like a silly side quest, but what that shows us unconsciously, unless you notice it, that Brown still hasn't morally evolved, even though they have settled down at the Yuma ferry. Because when they get there, they suddenly become civilized, sort of. They get wives. They start operating a business. And Brown goes, but if you remember about the gun he gets, there's some gold on the barrel of the shotgun. And he's telling the gun owner, saw it off. I don't care about the money. He just wants it as a weapon of utility to kill more people. He doesn't care about the money. All he cares about still is the killing, even when a domestication of sorts. And this is where McCarthy is masterful because anyone can go and find historical accounts of events, something like the Glanton Gang or the filibustering in the mid-1800s. And most of us are reasonable enough writers to adapt it and add action and add some intensity. But as Bloom notes, the kid refuses to be the center of the novel, even though it seems like there is a push for him to be the center. I just released a video titled Cormac McCarthy on Jesus, where I tie the kid to a messianic figure of sorts. And Cormac McCarthy ties him to Gnosticism and classic Christianity and Buddhism and many other things. But he's a failed Messiah. And I love Bloom's analysis here because at times he fades off. We don't hear about him for a while. And then suddenly he's out in the middle of a snowfield with the burning bush and he's the main character again. Then we're out at the Yuma ferry and there are side quests and we hear almost nothing from the kid. And then suddenly the Yumas attack and we're back with the kid again. And one could say with McCarthy's main tactic of a lack of interiority that you need to do this. That in every single one of his stories, especially the ones that have zero interiority, there always is a side quest. There's always a conversation with someone to bring out some merit. I think back to McCarthy's Southern novels, where it seems like every chapter a character is discussing something with an old-timer, hearing some form of philosophy that enables us to add deeper layers to our interpretation of the work. And that's all McCarthy is just, he spends years adding layers upon layers. There are thousands of hidden cryptic keys in Blood Meridian that I am still finding to this day. I read people's posts all the time online who are finding these. And this is what masterful writing does. And if you want to read Blood Meridian with a group and discover all of these secrets and find out some more together, I have a Cormac McCarthy course and a Cormac McCarthy book club. The book club is starting on Monday, and we will be reading multiple Cormac McCarthy books at a time, plus 6 to 8 other books from other authors. And if you are seeing this in the future, don't worry, because we will be reading Blood Meridian on repeat as a group for decades to come. So if you guys want more information about this and my writing group and the other courses, which are all included in the Substack, go check out the link in the description below, and let's continue on with the video. It somewhat subverts expectations because we think, and because we've seen many Westerns before, that is our center. We understand how the narrative's supposed to progress. Most of the time, especially in movies where a lot of us have gone in our axiomatic programming of Westerns, it's just not possible to add that level of layering because it's just the cinema isn't able to do that in the limited time span that it has. And I don't think, maybe you guys can correct me, that any Western TV show has ever really been able to accomplish that. When I think of something like Deadwood, it really focused more on dialogue and other themes rather than, layering it and making it maybe more of an avant-garde vision. So it's sneaky by McCarthy because we want the Clint Eastwood, we want the John Wayne, we want villains, but everybody's a villain. Judge Holden is the villain, but he really doesn't step into that role until the end of the novel. And Bloom talks about the narrative propulsiveness and the power of the book and the astonishing charge of language, which he thinks stems from Faulkner and Melville. But I'd like to push back here because people say this all the time, and it's true. Like, no doubt about it that he is very much inspired by Faulkner and Melville. But something that he does that they don't do is really write settings wonderfully. I understand in Faulkner, especially in things like his short story, The Bear, where McCarthy originally got kind of this nature style from, the complete version of The Bear. There are many different versions of it. And then obviously in Moby Dick, there are these heavy descriptions of whaling and the settings and all these types of things. But McCarthy takes it to an entirely new level. It's very postmodernist because McCarthy was standing on the shoulders of Faulkner, of Flannery O'Connor, who were dying or already dead when he was just starting his writing career. And as a major fan of both of those figures, what do? Well, it's the 1960s and you are in your late 20s and you're starting to see the evolution because most of the time novelists are way ahead of the curve in terms of the evolution of consciousness within the people. That's why someone like a Bob Dylan had such impactful lyrics and stuff way before the hippie era, or maybe some more deeper lyricism or commentary about war, because he was a poet. He could see beyond. And that's what a poet's job is. A poet's job is to be able to transcend political parties, to only honor their feelings and what that is and cross any boundary. And what's interesting about being a poet is that if you go and read the early drafts of Suttree in the Cormac McCarthy archives, no spoilers here, McCarthy refers to Suttree as the poet. But Suttree was the first work that McCarthy started working on in 1958, and it was autobiographical. It was a rebuke against his father and all the paternal trauma that he had suffered in his life. And it took him over 25 years, I think, to get it published because it was very hard for him to work out. I'm sure you've been in this situation before as a beginner writer. You start writing and then you think, wow, I've had these crazy experiences in my life. I'm going to write about myself. And it usually falls flat like that. Those have always been my worst workshops. Like when I write some story, it just doesn't seem right. It's not creative writing. It's a fucking memoir. So McCarthy tries to do that, but eventually, and at the start, he's calling himself the poet. And McCarthy we're going to be actually talking about this stuff very soon, was very into poetry, wrote some poetry, considered himself a poet, even though we never saw really too much of that poetry. He does have 2 published poems out there. And so McCarthy really stepped into this beautiful language and like these piercing ideas and themes because he did foreshadow a lot of things. Something I somewhat forgot to mention in my Cormac McCarthy on violence video is that he was right. McCarthy wrote about a necrophiliac in the 1960s before Ted Bundy came on the scene, before Jeffrey Dahmer or like these type of people were on the scene. He wrote about the oncoming cartel problem in 1976 in No Country for Old Men, which started as a screenplay and took a while to get released. He predicted a lot of the problems and ideas that were going to happen in The Passenger. It was very ahead of his time, and that's really what smart people are. When we see politicians and if they are not at the top of the meritocracy, it's not hard to predict where we are going to go. If you can escape political polarity and a lot of the emotions and gain a general amount of knowledge and be experienced in the world, you can make fairly reasonable predictions where we are going to be headed. But our politicians and anyone really that has a major voice is bought off by certain countries or organizations or has certain interests that they're trying to fulfill. So they're not going to give us the full story. And once again, most of the time, they're just not intelligent enough to see it. Or because if you are going to talk about, for instance, something like money or politics, you've probably been invested in that heavily your entire life. So you're not going to see it from a divergent angle because you have been inundated with Machiavelli and these types of things for your entire life. And that's why I say to people all the time, I'm like, guys, people a couple hundred years from now are going to look back at democracy and what we're doing now as like how we look back at monarchies. Like, it's silly. They're going to see it as just an extension of the monarchy. We just vote for people to rule over us. We haven't learned to rule ourselves yet. Crazy. All they could focus on was, improving the power of phones and all these different things instead of focusing on themselves. Like, how dumb were they? What were they actually doing with all their time, with their lives? Like, wow. Just like we look at the, people bowing down and serving the king and queen and all these dumb things. Like, dude, why would you do that? I'm so much better than that. Well, we're not most of the time because in retrospect, we're going to look really, really dumb. And it's not our fault. I know you're smart enough to comprehend all this. It's, the people in power's fault. Anyway. All that to say that McCarthy isn't necessarily a Faulkner and Melville copycat. He does do these postmodernist narratives and breaks that Faulkner and Melville actually never really dipped their toes into, because that literary style and those frames of how to write a novel, for instance, as a nightmare or as a recollection of a memory, those didn't really exist yet. And speaking of poets, Bloom evokes Blood Meridian here and Othello's Iago. And I guess spoilers for Othello here, everyone. I'm sorry. I mean, if we want to talk about this at a deep level, we've already spoiled Blood Meridian. Have we? I don't know. But so Iago, when we look at him, there are rumors that Othello is is with his wife, and he is upset because he keeps being looked over for promotions and these types of things. His irrational actions don't really connect to the anger that he should feel, even if those things were true. And Iago is a proto-nihilist that really helped establish nihilism in literature, at large for us, and future characters like Dostoevsky's Nikolai Stravogin in his book, The Devils or The Possessed or whatever. Iago really helped establish that. But Iago's famous line is, "I am not what I am." He is rejecting this kind of fixed identity that people have put on him because of his rank and title, and it kind of almost eliminates the self. And so he doesn't believe in truth. He's always manipulating others. And so when we look at Holden, this is very Holden-esque. I mean, Holden is trying to symbolize and simulacra the world and manipulate others to see that. And both are really smart. When you're looking at Iago's plans, you're like, holy shit, he's just manipulating Roderigo and Othello, and they're good. I mean, he's smart, and he's using hyper-rationality, much like Judge Holden, to enact this aim. And so I think it's an interesting analysis by Bloom, because I wouldn't connect Judge Holden to Iago on first thought, more to a Nietzschean will to power, or maybe some other characters, Dostoevsky, other people. But then when I look back at their influences, Nietzsche, a lot of the Russian writers, everyone goes back to Shakespeare. So I guess, and then everything goes back to the Bible. Like, we could go on that train forever. And of course, Bloom can play that trump card. Like, he's so comfortable and, read so much Shakespeare time and time again that he can just call back to that. And that's what's fun. And let me give you guys a tip. And we're talking about Shakespeare right now. And if you've never read Shakespeare, that's okay. I don't care if you're 50 or 60. I'm not here to shame you. You don't need to feel bad. But what's fun about Shakespeare is that it's not meant to be read in school. Honestly, you guys. I've tried to. I refused. I've taught high school English for 7 years, and I've never taught Shakespeare and never will. I was teaching college the same thing. The big classic guys, Wordsworth, Shakespeare, even Chaucer, they're meant to be read alone in like almost an intimate way. Like, it's fun. It's really cool, but it's your own personal journey. Like, being with a class and being on a timeline and hearing interpretations, that's not how you're supposed to do it, honestly. I first heard this tip from Robert Bly about the classics, and I had this bad taste in my mouth because I spent 8 years in university studying English and just reading this stuff time and time again. And the Victorian era of poetry. And it's like, oh my God, this shit sucks. But then I heard that, and I was spending the summer in Wyoming with my parents who lived there. And one entire summer, all I did was just read the classics. I mean, I'm always reading the classics. I was like, okay, I'm going to reread all this without school for my own personal pleasure. And I was mind blown. I finally saw what everyone else was talking about, because I would read Shakespeare and be like, okay, this is good. Like, damn, that was good. Like, that was really good. But then I could see when people were like, he's still the GOAT. And so that's my advice to you. You know, read these guys, not when your kid's screaming or at 9 o'clock when you have no energy and you're just trying to pour through a classic, but at a time in your life where you can you're relaxed, where you can really connect, and don't listen to me, don't listen to others. You know, it's fun to talk about Blood Meridian because we're a bunch of white guys who romanticize that period, but no one's romanticizing the 15th century. Excuse me, the 16th century and early 17th century, my bad. But only weird theater kids, you know? So this is for us, and then you'll develop an appreciation, then the scholarship, then the plays, and all that is going to, you know, feel much better for you. And so that's my advice to you. You know, if you can pour through it, if you can soldier your way through it because you're an OG, because you're a doctor, then I love you, and continue doing that. And sometimes you need to do that with the classics. But if you can't, if you've always hated it, relax into it. And I promise you, it will go a lot better. And you'll finally kind of see the light with a lot of these guys. So thank you guys for being here. And I will see you in the next video. Peace.